Director Kang felt a hand slip into his pocket. Not an assassin's blade, but a tiny, trembling hand. He clamped down on the wrist instantly. A little girl in a dirty white t-shirt froze, terror in her eyes. A man in a bright red jacket walked right past them, ignoring her tears. Kang growled, "You picked the wrong target." But then, her worn-out backpack hit the ground and spilled open. Inside, there were no stolen wallets, just empty medicine bottles and a crumpled eviction notice. "The Vipers took everything," she sobbed. That made the dragon of Seoul freeze. She wasn't stealing for greed, she was stealing for her dying mother. Stay with me, because what Director Kang did next didn't just save her life, it started a war. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe and comment where you're watching from. The neon signs of Gangnam didn't just glow, they burned, casting long, synthetic shadows over the wet pavement. Through this electric haze walked Kang Kyung-ho, a man whose silence was louder than the city's noise. They called him the Dragon of Seoul, not because he breathed fire, but because he hoarded power with a cold, reptilian detachment. He wore his reputation like his Italian suit, impeccably tailored, intimidatingly expensive, and blacker than a moonless night. Beneath the silk shirt, the ink of a dragon coiled from his chest up to his neck, its scales peeking out just above the collar. It was a warning label that everyone in the district knew how to read. Do not touch. Do not speak. Do not look too long. As he moved through the crowded market street, the sea of pedestrians parted. It was a fluid, instinctual dance of fear. Businessmen bowed their heads and hurried past. Street vendors suddenly found their shoes fascinating. Kang didn't acknowledge them. He didn't have to. In his world, eye contact was a currency, and most people couldn't afford the price. He checked his watch, a heavy gold piece worth more than the average citizen's annual salary. He was late for a meeting with the district heads, a formality to remind them who allowed them to breathe. His life was a series of these transactions, respect paid in fear, loyalty bought with violence. He had spent 20 years clawing his way up from the gutter to the penthouse, burying his conscience under layers of money and blood. He told himself he was a necessary evil, a predator who kept the lesser wolves at bay. The crowd thickened near the subway entrance. Here, the fear diluted into indifference. A man in a bright red outdoor jacket pushed aggressively through the throng, eyes glued to his smartphone, shoulders hunched against the world. He slammed his shoulder into an elderly woman, knocking her grocery bag askew, but he didn't even break stride. He just kept walking, a vibrant splash of color in a gray world, utterly numb to the existence of anyone else. Kang watched him with a sneer curling his lip. He often thought of himself as a monster, yet he looked at these innocent civilians and saw nothing but ice. They ignored the beggars, the elderly, the weak. At least Kang looked his victims in the eye before he broke them. The man in the red jacket was a different kind of sickness, the sickness of not caring at all. Distracted by his cynicism, Kang's guard dropped for a fraction of a second. He felt a disturbance in the air before he felt the touch, a shift in the rhythm of the street. Then, a presence at his side, too small to be a hitman, too quiet to be a drunk. He felt the slide of a hand into his jacket pocket. It was clumsy, trembling, amateurish. The audacity of it almost made him laugh. Someone was trying to rob the Dragon of Seoul. His reflexes, honed by years of surviving knife fights and ambushes, took over faster than thought. His hand shot out, clamping down on a thin wrist with the force of a hydraulic press. He expected to feel the rough skin of a junkie or the sinewy arm of a desperate thug. Instead, the wrist was bird-like, fragile. Kang stopped, his grip firm but not yet crushing. He turned his head slowly, prepared to deliver a punishment that would serve as a grim lesson to the entire street. But as he looked down, the neon lights reflected not in the eyes of an assassin, but in the terrified, wide eyes of a child who had made a fatal mistake. The wrist in his hand felt like a dry twig. One sharp twist and it would snap. Kang Kyung-ho didn't twist. He just held on, his grip an iron shackle, as he stared down at the thief who had dared to touch the dragon of Seoul. She couldn't have been more than 7 years old. She was drowning in a plain white t-shirt that had turned a dingy gray from street soot, the fabric hanging loosely off her small frame. Her hair was a tangled, matted mess, and her face was streaked with grime and fresh tears. She wasn't a hitman. She was a ghost, shivering violently in the neon glow of the district. "Who sent you?" Kang's voice was a low rumble, dangerous and deep. In his world, children were used as decoys, distraction bait for knives in the back. He scanned the crowd, expecting a viper enforcer to lunge. But no one moved. The man in the bright red jacket, the one who had shoved the elderly woman moments before, walked right past them. He didn't even glance at the imposing tattooed man threatening a weeping child. He just kept walking, his eyes glued to his phone, stepping around them like they were traffic cones. The indifference of the city wrapped around them, isolating the predator and his prey in a bubble of silence. "Please," the girl squeaked, her voice thin and brittle. I just..." She tried to pull away, her free hand flailing. In the struggle, her grip on the straps of her worn-out backpack slipped. The bag, frayed at the edges and discolored with age, hit the pavement with a dull, hollow thud. The zipper, already broken, gave way. Kang's eyes shifted from the girl's terrified face to the spill on the concrete. He expected to see the spoils of a day's worth of pickpocketing, wallets, watches, perhaps a stolen phone. He expected evidence of greed. What he saw made the air leave his lungs. There were no valuables. Rolling across the wet pavement were 3 orange prescription bottles. They were empty, the labels worn faded. Next to them lay a single, crumpled photograph that had slid out of a plastic sleeve. Kang felt his grip on her wrist loosen, his fingers uncurling involuntarily. He stared at the photo. It showed a woman young, but looking aged by sickness, lying in a hospital bed, hooked up to a web of tubes and monitors. She was smiling weakly at the camera, her hand holding the very same small hand that Kang had just been crushing. The girl didn't run. She dropped to her knees, not to beg for her life, but to scramble for the empty bottles, gathering them up as if they were made of gold. "Don't take them," she sobbed, clutching the plastic containers to her chest. "Mom needs them. The vipers took the money, but she needs the medicine." Kang stood frozen, his imposing posture crumbling from the inside out. He looked at the girl, then at the retreating back of the man in the red jacket, and finally back to the empty bottles. The rage that fueled him, the cold armor of the dragon, suddenly felt heavy and useless. He wasn't looking at a thief anymore. He was looking at a daughter fighting a war she had no business fighting, armed with nothing but a dirty bag and terrifying courage. The spell of silence was violently broken by the heavy, rhythmic thud of leather soles hitting the pavement. 2 men in dark suits pushed through the crowd, their movements sharp and aggressive. They were Kang's personal security, the Shadows, who were never supposed to be more than 3 steps behind him. They had been delayed by the pedestrian crush, and their failure to protect the boss's flank was etched in the panic on their faces. "Director," the lead bodyguard barked, his hand already reaching inside his jacket for a weapon. He scanned the scene, his eyes landing instantly on the small, trembling figure at Kang's feet. "Did this street rat touch you?" The guard didn't wait for an answer. He stepped forward, his massive shadow falling over the girl like a collapsing building. "You little filth," he snarled, reaching out to grab her by the collar of her oversized shirt. The girl squeezed her eyes shut and curled into a ball, clutching the empty medicine bottles to her chest as if they could shield her from a bullet. She didn't scream. She just braced herself for the impact, a reaction that spoke of a life filled with too many blows. "Stop!" The word wasn't shouted, but it cut through the noise of the street like a razor. The bodyguard's hand froze inches from the girl's shoulder. He looked up, confused. "Sir, she's a thief. The rules say." "I know the rules," Kang said, his voice dangerously low. "I wrote them." He looked at his men, men he had trained to be pit bulls. For the first time in 20 years, he didn't see loyal soldiers. He saw bullies towering over a starving child. The image sickened him. "Back off," Kang commanded, waving his hand dismissively. "Give us 10 feet, turn your backs. If anyone approaches, break them, but do not touch her." The guards exchanged a bewildered glance. The director never spared thieves, but the look in Kang's eyes, a strange mix of fury and something unrecognizable, told them that questioning him tonight would be a fatal error. They stepped back, forming a perimeter, their backs to the pair, turning the busy sidewalk into a private interrogation room. Kang looked down at his pristine Italian trousers, then at the wet, grimy pavement where the girl was kneeling. He didn't hesitate. Slowly, deliberately, the dragon of Seoul sank down. He ignored the damp cold seeping into the expensive fabric of his suit knees. He lowered himself until he was no longer a towering giant, but a man looking directly into the tear-filled eyes of a child. The shift in perspective was jarring. From down here, the city looked bigger, louder, and more terrifying. "Look at me," Kang said. His voice had lost its growl. It was steady, demanding, but quiet. The girl hesitated, then slowly opened one eye, then the other. She looked at him with the wariness of a trapped animal. She saw the tattoos on his neck, the scar above his eyebrow, the heavy gold chain. She trembled, her knuckles white around the orange bottles. "You're shaking," he observed. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words barely escaping her throat. I didn't want to steal, I promise." Kang reached out. The girl flinched violently, expecting a strike. Instead, Kang gently picked up the crumpled photograph from the pavement and held it out to her. "You said vipers," Kang said, watching her face intently. "You said they took everything." He leaned in closer, his dark eyes locking onto hers, searching for a lie. He found none. "People don't steal from me to get rich, kid. They steal from me because they have a death wish. But you," he glanced at the medicine bottles in her grip, "you're trying to keep someone alive." He pointed a tattooed finger at the photo. "Tell me the truth, every word. Why is a child doing a man's job?" Aurora wiped her nose on the sleeve of her dirty t-shirt, leaving a dark streak of soot across her cheek. The question hung in the damp air between them, a demand for truth from a man who usually punished it. "My dad borrowed money," she whispered, her voice trembling so hard the words nearly broke apart. "Before he left, he said he'd pay it back, but he never came home." Kang watched her knuckles turn white around the plastic bottles. He knew the story. It was the oldest story in Seoul. Desperate men made deals with devils, and when they fled or died, the devils came for the widows and orphans. "The vipers?" Kang asked, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. Aurora nodded, a fresh wave of tears spilling over. "They came yesterday, 3 big men. They smelled like smoke and old meat." She shuddered at the memory, her eyes losing focus as she relived the trauma. Mom had the money in the jar. It took her months to save it. It was for the refill. The doctor said if she misses another week. She couldn't finish the sentence. She just clutched the empty bottles tighter to her chest, as if sheer will could fill them back up. "They took it." "They said it was just interest," Aurora cried, the injustice of it making her small voice rise in pitch. "I told them. I screamed at them that it was for her heart. They just laughed. One of them, the one with the gold tooth," he pushed Mom down. He took the jar and broke it on the floor. Kang's jaw tightened until a muscle feathered in his cheek. He could see it clearly, the shattered glass, the weeping woman, the laughing thugs. The vipers were bottom feeders, scavengers who fed on the decaying carcasses of the poor. They didn't have territory, they had victims. "I went to the police station," Aurora confessed, looking down at her worn sneakers, the rubber soles peeling away from the fabric. "The officer at the desk, he wouldn't even look at me. He said to stop wasting his time and go home." She looked up at Kang then, her eyes wide with a terrifying, hollow hopelessness that no child should ever know. It was the look of someone who had screamed for help until their voice was gone, only to realize no one was listening. "But I can't go home, not empty-handed," she choked out. "If I go back without the medicine, Mom won't wake up tomorrow. I know she won't. I hear her breathing at night. It sounds like broken glass inside her chest." She gestured helplessly to his suit, his watch, the aura of wealth that radiated off him. "You looked like a king," she whispered. "I thought, if I just took a little bit, you wouldn't even notice, and maybe I could buy the pills, just for one more week." The confession hung heavy in the air. She wasn't a criminal. She was a daughter bargaining with the universe, trading her safety for her mother's breath. She had looked at the dragon of Seoul, a man who killed for sport, and saw him not as a threat, but as a lifeline. Kang looked at the crumpled eviction notice peeking out of the bag. He looked at the girl who was shaking not from the cold, but from the sheer weight of a world that had crushed her before she'd even had a chance to grow. "They took everything," she whispered, the fight draining out of her. "Now we have nothing." "No," Kang said, the single word landing with the weight of a gavel. He slowly stood up, towering over her once again. But the menace was gone. In its place was something colder, sharper, and infinitely more dangerous. "You don't have nothing, kid. You have my attention." The shift in Kang Kyung-ho was instantaneous. The shock that had momentarily paralyzed him evaporated, replaced by a glacier-cold fury that was infinitely more terrifying than his anger. The dragon of Seoul had been sleeping, content in his high tower, but the vipers had just stepped on his tail. He looked at the empty medicine bottles in Aurora's hands. They were an indictment of his city, of his rule. In his territory, people paid him so things like this didn't happen. The vipers weren't just thieves. They were a cancer growing in his backyard, feeding on the weak because they were too cowardly to challenge the strong. Kang straightened his jacket, smoothing the lapels with a slow, deliberate motion. The movement was so precise, so eerily calm, that his bodyguards took an involuntary step back. They knew that calm. It was the silence before a massacre. "Get up," Kang said, extending a hand. Aurora flinched, curling tighter into herself. She looked at his hand, large, scarred, adorned with heavy gold, as if it were a trap. "I said get up," he repeated, softening the rumble of his voice just enough to bridge the gap of fear. "You're done kneeling." Hesitantly, she reached out. Her small, grime-streaked fingers disappeared into his palm. He pulled her to her feet with effortless strength. She swayed, dizzy from hunger and adrenaline, and he steadied her, his hand resting on her shoulder not as a restraint, but as an anchor. "Director," the lead bodyguard stepped forward again, eyeing the girl's dirty clothes with open disdain. "The police station is 2 blocks over. We can drop her off in." "No police," Kang cut him off, his voice flat. "Bring the car around." "Sorry." "The car," Kang said, turning his gaze on the guard. The look in his eyes was dead, void of any light or mercy. "Now." The guard swallowed hard, the color draining from his face. He tapped his earpiece, barking frantic orders. Seconds later, a sleek black sedan, a phantom of German engineering, glided to the curb. The tinted windows were darker than the night, promising total isolation from the cruel world outside. Aurora stared at the machine. To her it looked like a spaceship. She looked down at her muddy sneakers, then at the pristine polished door and shrank back. I'll get it dirty," she whispered, clutching her broken backpack. Kang didn't answer. He walked over to the rear passenger door and opened it himself. It was a gesture reserved for dignitaries, for fellow warlords, for people who mattered. He held the door open and looked at her. "Get in," he said. "Am I going to jail?" she asked, her lower lip trembling. "No," Kang replied, his eyes scanning the street, already calculating the path of destruction he was about to carve through the district. "You're going to get warm." Aurora hesitated for one last second, then climbed into the cavernous back seat. She perched on the edge of the cream leather, afraid to lean back. Kang shut the door with a solid, expensive thud, sealing her inside the quiet luxury. He walked around to the other side and slid in beside her. The interior smelled of cedar and expensive cologne, a stark contrast to the smoke and old meat she had described on the Vipers. "Driver," Kang said, staring straight ahead into the dashboard lights, "go to the private clinic on 4th. Tell Dr. Choi to prep a room." "For you, sir?" the driver asked, glancing nervously in the rearview mirror at the dirty child huddled in the corner. "For my guest," Kang said. He pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over a contact listed only as the butcher. "And tell the rest of the crew to suit up. We're going hunting." The phone in Kang's hand didn't ring. The call connected instantly, as if the person on the other end had been waiting for the breath of a command. "Director," a voice answered. It was rough, like gravel grinding on concrete. "Park, his chief of operations." "Code Red," Kang said. He didn't raise his voice. He spoke with the casual indifference of a man ordering dinner, but the temperature in the car seemed to drop 10 degrees. "The Viper clan. Every rat hole, every gambling den, every loan office. I want them purged." "The Vipers?" Park paused, confusion bleeding into his tone. "Sir, they're bottom feeders. They aren't worth the ammo." "They touched a civilian," Kang replied, his eyes flickering to Aurora, who was making herself as small as possible in the corner of the leather seat. "They crossed the line." "Understood," Park said, the confusion instantly replaced by the snap of professional obedience. "How do you want it done?" "Loud," Kang said. "Burn it down." He hung up. Across the city, the underbelly of Seoul began to shift. The Vipers were used to street thugs, loud men in tracksuits who swung bats and screamed threats to scare widows. They operated on chaos, noise, and fear. They were stray dogs fighting over scraps. Kang's organization was different. They were the wolves. In the basement of a high-end Gangnam nightclub, the music cut out. 30 men who had been sitting in comfortable silence stood up in unison. There were no tracksuits here. They wore tailored charcoal suits, crisp white shirts, and black ties. They didn't shout or posture. They moved with the terrifying efficiency of a surgical team preparing for an operation. Duffel bags were unzipped on mahogany tables. Out came matte black batons, tactical vests, and silenced pistols. There was no clattering, no bravado, just the metallic click-click of magazines being checked and slides being racked. They were an army disguised as businessmen, monsters dressed for a funeral. Back in the sedan, Aurora stared out the window as the city blurred by. She saw other black cars pulling out of alleys and side streets, slipping into formation behind them. A convoy of sharks swimming through traffic. Are those your friends?" she whispered, looking at the headlights trailing them. "Employees," Kang corrected gently. He looked at his reflection in the dark window. He had spent years building this wall of iron around his territory. He demanded discipline. His men didn't harm the innocent. They protected the ecosystem that allowed them to thrive. The Vipers were a disease in that ecosystem, chaotic, messy, and cruel without purpose. "The men who hurt your mom," Kang said, turning to face her. "They think they are strong because they are loud. They think they own the night because they break things." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a pristine white handkerchief. He handed it to her. "Wipe your face, Aurora. You're with me now." She took the cloth, the silk soft against her bruised knuckles. "Tonight," Kang said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the chassis of the car, "you're going to see the difference between a thug and a king." The convoy turned a corner, the engines growing into a collective growl. They weren't just driving to a fight. They were driving to an execution of justice, delivered by men in suits who wouldn't leave a single fingerprint behind. The sedan idled at the curb of the District General Hospital, a towering block of gray concrete stained by smog and neglect. This wasn't the private medical center where Kang treated his wounds. This was where the city sent people it had forgotten. Kang stepped out, the polished leather of his shoes striking the cracked sidewalk. The automatic doors slid open with a grinding shudder, releasing a blast of stale air that smelled of bleach, boiled cabbage, and hopelessness. He adjusted his cufflinks and walked in, Aurora trailing close to his leg like a shadow. Inside, the waiting room was a purgatory of plastic chairs and coughing patients. When Kang entered, the room went quiet. He was an apex predator walking through a herd of the sick. Nurses paused mid-step. A security guard looked at Kang's suit and the scars on his neck, then wisely decided to look at his phone instead. "Where is she?" Kang asked, his voice cutting through the hum of fluorescent lights. "Room 302, Aurora whispered, clutching the strap of her broken backpack. "Bed C." They took the elevator. It rattled as it ascended, the metal groaning. When the doors opened on the third floor, the smell of despair was thicker. This was the ward for those who couldn't pay, a long hallway lined with beds separated only by thin, stained curtains. Aurora let go of his jacket and ran ahead, ducking through a curtain halfway down the hall. Kang followed, his movements slow and deliberate. He swept the curtain aside and froze. The woman in the bed looked younger than he expected, but her face was gaunt, the skin stretched tight over her cheekbones. She was unconscious, her breathing shallow and rattling in her chest. A single IV line was taped to her arm, but the bag hanging above her was empty. On the bedside table there was no food, no flowers, no water. Just a clipboard with a bright red sticker, payment overdue, discharge pending. Kang stared at the sticker. It was a death sentence printed on office stationery. "Mom," Aurora whispered, standing on her tiptoes to touch the woman's forehead. "Mom, I'm back. I brought help." The woman didn't stir. Kang looked around the cramped space. He saw the woman's hands resting on the thin blanket. They were rough, calloused, the nails chipped, the hands of someone who had worked herself into the ground trying to survive. Beside the bed, folded neatly on a chair, was a waitress uniform with a name tag that read Jaiwoo. It wasn't the violence of the vipers that hit him then. It was the quiet, crushing banality of their poverty. He had been shot, stabbed, and beaten in his life, but looking at this woman dying over a debt that cost less than the bottle of scotch sitting on his desk, that hit him harder than a bullet. He felt a tightness in his chest that he hadn't felt in decades. It was shame. He ruled this city. He claimed to keep order. Yet here, in his shadow, a mother was fatting away because she couldn't afford the price of living. Kang reached out and gently touched the empty IV bag. It was dry. "Director." Kang turned. A doctor was standing at the curtain's edge, looking terrified. He had clearly been summoned by a nervous nurse. "Why is this bag empty?" Kang asked. He didn't shout. He didn't have to. The air in the small cubicle grew heavy and suffocating. The account is frozen," the doctor stammered, sweating. "The administration. We can't administer more medication until—" Kang reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a thick envelope of cash, the walking around money he carried for bribes and tips. He tossed it onto the bedside table. It landed with a heavy thud next to the eviction notice. "Fix it," Kang said. "Now." "Sir, this is—" "Get her stabilized," Kang commanded, turning his back on the doctor to look at Aurora. "Then move her. My driver is outside. She goes to the Choi Clinic tonight, VIP suite." He looked down at Aurora, who was staring at him as if he had just parted the sea. "Stay with her," Kang said softly to the girl. "Pack her things." "Where are you going?" Aurora asked, panic flaring in her eyes. Kang straightened his jacket, the cold mask of the dragon sliding back into place. He looked at the window, where the city lights glittered like diamonds on black velvet. Somewhere out there, the vipers were counting their money. "I have a bill to settle," he said. The Viper clan's headquarters was exactly what Kang expected. A basement gambling den masquerading as a karaoke bar, smelling of cheap cologne, cigarettes, and fear. It was loud, chaotic, and disorganized, a perfect reflection of the men who ran it. The bouncer at the steel-reinforced door didn't even have time to radio a warning. One moment he was standing guard. The next, he was unconscious, dragged silently into the shadows by two of Kang's suits. The door was unlocked not with a key, but with a breaching charge that blew the hinges inward with a deafening thump. Inside, the music died instantly. 30 heads turned. They saw a wall of charcoal suits stepping through the smoke. Kang's men moved like a phalanx, batons extended, faces impassive. They didn't shout. They simply swept into the room, a tidal wave of discipline crashing into a shoreline of thugs. The Vipers scrambled for weapons, baseball bats, knives, a few rusted pistols. It was useless. The first Viper to charge was met with a baton strike to the knee so precise it sounded like a gunshot. He folded, screaming. The rest of the room erupted into violence, but it was one-sided. Kang's men dismantled them with surgical efficiency, breaking arms and clearing a path through the center of the room. Through this corridor of controlled violence walked Kang Kyung-ho. He didn't look at the brawls happening on either side of him. He stepped over a groaning man clutching a broken jaw, his eyes fixed on the glass-walled office at the back of the room. He kicked the office door open. Inside, the leader of the Vipers, a man named Jang, with a snake tattoo winding up his neck, was frantically trying to shove stacks of cash into a duffel bag. He looked up, his eyes widening as he recognized the figure filling his doorway. "Director Kang," Jang stammered, backing up until he hit his desk. This is a misunderstanding. We pay our tribute. We stay in our lane." Kang didn't speak. He walked over to the desk, picked up a heavy crystal ashtray, and casually tossed it aside. He sat on the edge of the mahogany desk, crossing his legs, looking every inch the corporate executive, save for the dragon scales peeking out from his collar. "You run a loan business, Jang," Kang said, his voice terrifyingly conversational. Yes, just small loans. High risk, you know." Jang's hands were shaking. "If we owe you a cut, I can pay double, triple, just name the number." Kang reached into his inner pocket. Jang flinched, expecting a gun. Instead, Kang pulled out a folded, dirty piece of paper, the eviction notice he had taken from Aurora's bag. He smoothed it out on the desk next to the piles of dirty money. "I'm not here for a cut," Kang said softly. "I'm here to collect a debt." "A debt?" Jang blinked, confused. "I don't owe you anything." "You took a jar of coins from a dying woman yesterday," Kang said, his voice dropping an octave, the temperature in the room plummeting. "You broke it on the floor. You laughed." Jang's face went blank. "What, that? That was just some deadbeat widow, nobody. She owed us interest." Kang stood up. The movement was so sudden Jang nearly fell over. "She wasn't nobody," Kang snarled, the mask slipping just enough to reveal the monster beneath. "She was a mother, and the little girl who watched you do it, she came to me." Jang's blood ran cold. He looked at the eviction notice, then at the Dragon of Seoul. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He hadn't just bullied a poor family, he had inadvertently summoned the devil. "You hurt a child to make a point," Kang said, stepping closer until he was invading Jang's personal space. "So now I'm going to make one." "It was just business," Jang pleaded, raising his hands. "You're right," Kang said, grabbing Jang by the lapels of his tacky suit. "And your business is liquidated." Kang shoved Jang backward with a burst of raw power. The Viper leader flew across the small office, crashing into a metal filing cabinet before crumbling to the floor, gasping for air. Outside the shattered glass walls of the office, the sound of fighting had ceased. It was replaced by the mechanical, rhythmic noise of destruction. Kang's men were systematically tearing the place apart. Slot machines were being smashed open with sledgehammers, their circuits sparking and dying. Computer servers containing blackmail material were being drilled through. The illegal gambling den was being reduced to scrap metal and dust. Kang didn't look back at the chaos he had unleashed. His eyes were scanning the messy desk. He ignored the stacks of dirty cash and the bags of pills. He was looking for the chains. He found it under a pile of racing forms, a thick black ledger. The vipers were old-fashioned predators. They didn't trust the cloud. They kept their secrets on paper. Kang flipped the heavy cover open. The pages were filled with rows of names, dates, and exorbitant interest rates written in red ink. It was a catalog of misery, hundreds of families trapped in a cycle they could never escape. He ran his finger down the list until he stopped at a name near the bottom. Lee Jae-woo. Next to her name was the principal amount, a pitifully small sum, followed by column after column of late fees and interest that had ballooned the debt into a life sentence. That's my property," Jang wheezed from the floor, wiping blood from his mouth. He tried to stand, but a look from Kang pinned him back down. "You can take the cash, Director. Take all of it, just leave the book. That's our leverage." "Leverage?" Kang repeated, the word tasting sour. "You call starving a 7-year-old girl leverage?" He reached into his pocket and pulled out a gold Zippo lighter. He flicked the lid open with a metallic clink. The flame sprang to life, dancing in the reflection of his dark eyes. "Wait!" Jang scrambled forward on his hands and knees, panic overriding his pain. "Do you know how much money is in there? That book is worth millions. You're burning money." "No," Kang said, holding the flame to the corner of the page marked Jae-woo. "I'm balancing the books." The paper curled and blackened. The fire caught quickly, hungry for the dry ink. Kang watched the name Lee Jae-woo disappear into ash. He didn't stop there. He held the burning page until the binding caught, until the fire began to eat through the names of every other victim listed in the red ink. He tossed the burning ledger onto the desk, right on top of the duffel bag stuffed with the Viper's cash. The money, the blood money squeezed from the neighborhood's poorest, ignited instantly. "No," Jang screamed, watching his empire turn to smoke. The fire alarm finally blared, a shrill ringing that cut through the room. The sprinkler system hesitated, then triggered, but not before the heart of the Viper operation was scorched beyond recognition. Kang stepped out of the office, fixing his cuffs. The heat of the fire was at his back, but he felt cold, precise, and finished. His men stopped destroying the room and fell into formation behind him. They walked out of the smoking ruin of the club, leaving the Vipers broken, bankrupt, and buried in the ashes of their own greed. The debt was paid. The morning sun filtering through the blinds of the VIP suite didn't look like the gray, smoggy light Aurora was used to. It looked like gold. She blinked her eyes open, her body tensing instinctively as she expected the cold draft of their apartment or the chaotic noise of the general hospital. Instead, she heard silence. A soft, rhythmic beep was the only sound in the room. She sat up, the plush blanket falling away. The room smelled of fresh linen and expensive flowers. In the large bed next to her, her mother was sleeping. It wasn't the fitful, pained unconsciousness of the last few weeks, but a deep, restorative sleep. The lines of pain on her forehead had smoothed out, and the color was slowly returning to her cheeks. The door opened softly, and a nurse in a crisp blue uniform entered. She smiled when she saw Aurora, a genuine, unhurried smile. "You're awake," the nurse said softly. "Dr. Choi just checked on her. She's stable. The new medication is working perfectly." Aurora looked at the IV drip, then back at the nurse, the old fear gripping her chest like a vice. "The bill," she whispered, her voice tiny. "We can't. We don't have money. The Vipers took it." "There is no bill," the nurse replied, setting a tray of warm breakfast on the side table. "The account has been settled. The surgery, the room, the rehabilitation, it's all paid for, indefinitely." Aurora stared at her, her mouth falling open. "By who?" The nurse didn't answer directly. She simply pointed to the foot of Aurora's chair. "Someone left this for you." It was her backpack. The mud had been scrubbed from the canvas and the broken zipper had been repaired. Aurora pulled it onto her lap. It felt heavier. She opened it to find the empty orange bottles were gone, replaced by new ones, full to the brim. Tucked into the front pocket, where the crumpled eviction notice used to be, was a thick white envelope. She didn't need to open it to know it was enough to keep the landlord away for a long time. She scrambled off the chair and ran to the large window that overlooked the clinic's private driveway. Down below, a sleek black sedan was idling, its engine purring with a low rumble. Leaning against the passenger door was a figure cut from darkness. Kang Kyung-ho stood like a statue, his black suit absorbing the morning light. He wasn't looking at his phone. He wasn't rushing past to get somewhere else. He was looking up. His gaze was fixed squarely on her window. The distance was far, but Aurora could see his face. The terrifying mask of the dragon was gone, replaced by a quiet, solemn watchfulness. For a heartbeat, their eyes met through the glass. Aurora thought of the man in the bright red jacket on the street, the normal citizen who had walked past her weeping without breaking stride. He was the one who let the world crumble because it didn't inconvenience him. He was the empty shell. But the man down there, the gangster, the brute, the monster everyone feared, he had stopped. When the whole world looked away, he was the only one who had looked closely enough to see the truth. Kang gave a single, barely perceptible nod. It was a final transaction, a silent acknowledgement that the debt was paid. He turned, slid into the back of the phantom car, and the vehicle slipped away into the stream of Seoul's traffic, disappearing like a shadow at noon. Aurora pressed her small hand against the cold glass, watching the spot where he had stood. She knew she would likely never see him again. He belonged to the dark underbelly of the city, and he had returned her to the light. But as she turned back to the warmth of the room and her sleeping mother, she finally understood. The city could call him a devil all they wanted. She knew better. He was her guardian angel.